Breaking news mga kabayan, sa patuloy na Manila Dialogue on the South China Sea 2025, si Dr. Sophie Yi, mayabang na representante ng China, sinisisi ang Pilipinas kung bakit nagkaroon ng agresyon ang China sa West Philippine Sea. Ayon sa kanya, wala daw inaagaw ang China. Ang ginagawa daw na interception ng People's Liberation Army Navy at People's Liberation Army Air Force sa mga barko at eroplano ng Pilipinas dahil tayo daw mismo ang pumapasok sa teritoryo ng China. Naloko na pero hindi nakalusot si Dr. Sophie Yi sa mga iskolar na Pilipino at maging kay Commodore Jay Tarriela ng Philippine Coast Guard. Sinabi ng mga Pilipino kung talagang seryoso at gusto ng China na magkaroon ng oil at gas joint exploration sa West Philippine Sea. Payag din ba na magkaroon ng joint oil at gas exploration ang China at Pilipinas sa loob ng exclusive economic zone ng China?
The question is China willing to do joint development in its own EEZ, say Philippine-China joint development within 200 nautical miles of mainland China?
Quickly say that I also care a lot about Filipino fishermen. So does I care about Chinese fishermen. I also care about what is happening right now in Philippines, the natural disasters, the typhoons. Philippines declare a state of emergency because of the typhoon. I mean, China can work with the Philippines to provide more technical supports regarding disaster relief. If you ask any Chinese citizen, they will tell you that the military, they actually work on natural disaster relief inside China. And that is why they are called the most adorable person in China. And secondly, I want to respond to the gray zone concepts. I'm not very fond of the word of gray zone. This is a concept that, it's not an objective concept. This concept has provided some kind of negative perception over what someone could describe as military operations other than war. I think that is more of the term that I would use rather than gray zone operations. Because if a country, say China, employs military operations other than war, they're sending coast guards, not navies, there is an incentive that we don't want escalation in military confrontations. That's why the coast guards are there. And going back to the August 11th clash, I think you've mentioned the tonnage of different vessels, but at that point, as I mentioned before, China sees it as an incursion. I don't think we can reach an agreement on whatever that means or definition, so I don't want to continue that debate, but I wanted to remind you that it was a very smaller ship, as you mentioned, comparing to Chinese naval ship and the Coast Guard ship. So it was traveling at a very high speed. So collisions like that happens, of course. If that's what happens when both vessels belong to the same country, imagine what happens in three-way encounters between Chinese, Philippines, and US vessels in the same ways, in the same waters. I don't need to remind you that China and US and Philippines shares the mutual defense agreement. I think China and the Philippines are both concerned, and so does the US, about what will happen and what could trigger that mutual defense agreement. And if you pay more attention to President Trump's speech recently, he didn't quite mention South China Sea. He's focused a lot more on doing a good trade deal with China. I don't think South China Sea is top on his list. And I think that is what the Philippine government should think about as well. And I want to also mention that Ray mentioned the 1974 and 1988 incidents. I want to bring out the border picture. What happens back then? There was a very different structural framework globally. But then it was a Cold War. With Vietnam, there were two Vietnams, two different governments. And during the 1988, there was the Cold War where the Soviet Union and the Americans are competing for influence in the region. And China had obviously concerns about how things will unfold. And in 1988, the incidents, there were very clear instructions from the top of the command that the Chinese should not fire the first shots. I know this might subject to disagreement and arguments about who really fired the first shots, but I think for the Chinese side, Chinese had no intention to escalate any kinds of military confrontation into a full-scale war. That has been very consistent since the 1970s, and later on 1990s we share our good views as we continue our economic reform. China focused a lot on its economic development, and I think that is also what the Philippines and other ASEAN countries should think about. The former leader of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, he actually said this at Chatham House in London, I think 2 weeks back. He said most of the Asian countries don't see China as a security threat. Then why should the Philippines see China as a security threat? We can work on a lot of stuff. The militaries can work on how we can provide better support to disaster relief, like supporting things like the typhoon currently happening in Philippines. Because the Hainan Island in China also suffers from typhoon and other natural disaster relief. We have experiences to share. We don't need to focus on the things that we cannot agree with each other all the time.
China Sea as part of the gray zone tactics. Because in the Philippines, we call it illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive. How would you call it? My third question, in case you ran out of time, I want you to prioritize this third last question of mine. 2 years ago, I attended Manila Dialogue. I asked your defense minister why there is a disconnect between China's words and China's actions when it comes to the South China Sea. Thank you.
Great. So, Sophie, just if you could list all of them, we'll come to Jeff and then, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick comment to the question raised by Dr. Yi, actually. She asked why can Vietnam and China do joint development, but not China and the Philippines. I think that's apples and oranges, actually, because that agreement happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. There is a legitimate overlap between Chinese and Vietnamese EEZ. There is no legitimate overlap between Philippine and Chinese EEZ. And in fact, there are no other successful case of joint development in the South China Sea. Indonesia and China has no successful joint development. Malaysia and China has no successful joint development. Why? Because of the 9-dash line. That's the only reason there. There is no overlap, legitimate overlap. And so it seems to me that China is interested to do joint development in others' EEZ. The question is China willing to do joint development in its own EEZ, say Philippine-China joint development within 200 nautical miles of mainland China? Because if that's the case, then that's truly making China a sincere actor in terms of pursuing joint development. Thank you.
Thank you. It's what is mine, what is yours is shared kind of concept. Yes.
Dr. Sophie Yi. So you often emphasize the idea of shelving disputes to allow cooperation to move forward. But given the evident asymmetry between China and the Philippines in both capability and strategic intent, may I ask from your perspective, what factors make it difficult for China to also consider moderating or shelving some of its, more expansive maritime claims, especially since the Philippines, as you frame, poses no threat to China's security. Doing so might in fact enhance mutual trust and demonstrate its regional leadership in promoting stability. Thank you.
I'm happy that at least Chinese voices are out and you're actually interested in listening to a Chinese who is not the government though. I think on the question or the comment Jeffrey gave or the commander gave there I think Professor Hu actually answered a lot of it. But just on gray zone, I've already gave my answer. Is military operations other than war. That is not signals a negative conceptualization of that nature of the operations, but rather tells you very objectively the intention of the military operations is not for war, but to manage the tensions. And also for militarization, this word came out quite a lot. But really, how to define militarization? Do you have a very clear indicator of how we measure one's militarization? I mean, the words like securitization, militarization, they come out a lot in the academia. But really, what does those words mean? I don't think a lot of us really read the academic journal articles. I mean, I have to do it because I have to do it for my PhD. So I think I had a pretty good understanding of the conceptions are up for interpretation. And I didn't want to get into the arguments that we could not reach an agreement on. But I think I want to also briefly touch on what we can do to manage the situation. I have mentioned that there are things we cannot resolve and should stop wasting time on. For example, who has valid historical rights on features, and whether the 2016 tribunal and whether FONOP's near disputed features are legitimate, and other things that the list goes on. These debates have consumed years with zero progress, and I think a lot of you that has been through a lot of the South China Sea conferences will share this sentiment, right? We reach nowhere by talking about the old topics day in and day out. What's the point? And meanwhile, we are really seeing the collision risk increase. So here's my suggestion on the things we can resolve with political will. Firstly, communication protocols between Coast Guards during encounters, procedures for emergency situations, medical evacuation, rescue operations, advance notification for certain types of operations, agreed definitions of dangerous maneuvers, regular commander meetings to build trust. Strategic checks is lacking. I don't think it exists between China and the US or China and the Philippines. And that is something that we could work towards by attending and speaking and exchanging ideas at forums like this. Hotlines that function during crisis, protocols for fishing vessel safety. None of this require resolving sovereignty.
Laban Pinas.